You are listening to an Art Media podcast.
People are committed to Israel, but are troubled with many of the things that Israel is doing. And they're trying to maintain a relationship, being committed and troubled at the same time. But for many of them, they've lived for 15 years with a government that doesn't reflect their liberal values. When you add a Ben Gvir and a Smotrich to the equation, they're asking themselves, what future does my relationship with Israel have? Doesn't mean that they're voting for Mamdani as an expression of an anti-Israel. They're just tired. They don't want to have an Israel-centric relationship. And they'll therefore vote for somebody because he reflects other liberal values.
New York is the capital city, not just of American Jewry, but of the diaspora. To have a representative of the camp that turned Jewish students on campus into pariahs as the mayor of New York is a violation. And the fact that so many Jews turned their backs on the rest of the Jewish community, never mind Israel, they turned their backs on American Jewry. They turned their backs on their fellow New York Jews. That's what's eating at me.
This is part 2 of our conversation with Donniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi about Zohran Mamdani and Jewish voters in New York City who voted for him and how that is perceived over here in the U.S., in the diaspora, and from Israel. But before today's conversation, a word from our sponsor. One of the most enduring strengths of the Jewish people is our instinct to take responsibility for one another. It's a guiding principle of the Jewish Communal Fund. For more than 50 years, the Jewish Communal Fund has been a home for Jewish philanthropy, making it easy, impactful, and tax smart to give. Recently, JCF fund holders granted over $1 billion to a wide range of 501c3 charities in a single year, much of it going to Jewish causes, day school scholarships and food pantries, emergency aid for Israel, and programs fighting anti-Semitism here at home. A JCF donor-advised fund lets you contribute appreciated assets, take your deduction this year, and direct support when it's needed most, whether that's rebuilding a community in Israel or strengthening Jewish education in New York. When you give through JCF, you're investing in Jewish life. To learn more about opening your fund by December 31st to lock in 2025's tax advantages, follow the link in the show notes or go to jcfny.org, the Jewish Communal Fund, where giving back means building the Jewish future. I was listening actually before we recorded this podcast to your most recent episode of For Heaven's Sake, where you guys were trying to make sense of not just Mamdani's election, but by this peculiar voting bloc in the New York City electorate of Jews that voted for Mamdani. And you guys
here we
were
go
wrestling
again,
with
Donniel.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. It's like that line from the Godfather. The more I try to walk away, they suck me back in. I'm sucking you. I'm sucking you back in because I felt that the whole discussion was unnecessary overreaction. Meaning, I don't think there should be overreaction to the election of Mamdani. But I think we are so worried, so many of us, by this narrative, and it predates Mamdani, by the way. We're obsessed with these young Jews who've turned on Israel. And I cannot tell you how many times I could give interviews and they say, well, young Jews are, protesting against Israel for the first time. They're breaking with Israel. And I'm seeing the same thing with this Mamdani, the reaction to Mamdani. CNN comes out with one exit poll. This is the whole debate. Your whole discussion, and For Heaven's Sake, was based on this one CNN exit poll that said some 30% of New York City Jews voted for Mamdani.
Do you have any other facts?
All I know is this: early exit polls are typically, not always, unreliable. So it usually takes a few weeks for the very thorough exit polling to come out, where there's a bunch of survey data done, where there are serious follow-ups with people who voted for Mamdani, because all those polls are usually doing is just catching people walking out of the voting. Oh, are you Jewish? That could mean many things. Obviously, I don't need to tell you guys this. So what you really need to do is you need to go precinct by precinct, which hasn't been done yet, and you know which precincts are heavily Jewish neighborhoods and which aren't. I suspect when the thorough exit polling is done, the number is going to be significantly lower than 30%. Let me start with that. Now, okay, so it's 20%. That's still not nothing, right? I mean, that's one in five voters, Jewish voters, voting for Mamdani, given what Mamdani represents, is shocking. However, of that subset, how many of those voters are the students in Harvard Yard standing with Students for Justice in Palestine saying, I'm a Jew and I'm here because I'm against Israel, because I'm anti-Zionist?
You see, Dan, I think you're conflating two issues.
Okay.
Everybody know, and I think here and in many ways I think you're under evaluating a serious problem that we have. Mm-hmm. It is absolutely clear that the percentage of Jews who are part of JVP, of Jews for Justice in Palestine and those other groups is minuscule. Minuscule. I'm not worried about this anti-Zionist phenomena. It might grow, and I don't know the exact percentage, but I agree that it's still very, very small, maybe 5%. It's not a big deal. And there are those who don't want to have a relationship with Israel, are very careful to say, I'm not anti-Zionist, I'm non-Zionist. Like there's this, as if, I just want a Judaism which is not centered around Israel. Fair enough. But the larger sphere is a sphere that I have spent most of my career with, and I call them the troubled committed. People are committed to Israel, but are troubled with many of the things that Israel is doing. And they're trying to maintain a relationship, being committed and troubled at the same time. But for many of them, they've lived for 15 years with a government that doesn't reflect their liberal values. When you add a Ben Gvir and a Smotrich to the equation, and they're asking themselves, what future does my relationship with Israel have? They are more and more troubled. Doesn't mean that they're voting for Mamdani as an expression of an anti-Israel. They're just tired. They don't want to have an Israel-centric relationship. And they'll therefore vote for somebody because he reflects other liberal values. That's what I was trying to say. It's not that there's an anti-Zionist wave capturing the Jewish world. We do see a significant wave of anti-Semitism in on the right and on the left, whatever that might be. In the Jewish community, people are on the fence. But what's most dangerous for us as Jews is not when Jews become anti-Zionists. It's just when they don't care anymore. When they become untroubled, uncommitted. It's too different from my Judaism. It's too different from my values. And when I'm going to make choices, whether it's good for Israel or not, is just not going to be central to what I decide. That is not a minor, insignificant group of people.
That trouble committed, before you get to Mamdani, where were these trouble committed on October 8th?
Where were they? Unequivocally with Israel.
Okay.
Unquestionably. Not even a peep, nothing. Completely.
So that tells me everything. 15th. That tells me everything you need to know.
Of course, but February 15th, where were they?
But why? What's February 15th?
Because October 8th, those who condemned Israel on October 8th were anti-Semitic. Those who blame us for October 7th, those who deny our right to defend ourselves, you're outside. By February 15th, May 22nd, wherever it might be.
Oh, you're just saying months into the war. You're just picking dates. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Who are saying, what does it mean? This is a just war, but what does it mean to fight a just war justly? They're struggling. They're worried. They're adding into their prayers and shuls also for humanitarian aid. They're realizing that I love Israel, but I'm committed to the fact that all people are created in the image of God.
Can I give you my response to those people?
Fair enough.
These are largely people, and this is going to be harsh what I'm going to say. Whether they're young or old, they need to grow up, okay? Because what they're really uncomfortable with is not Israel. They're uncomfortable with war. War is ugly. They operated from a sense of survival, but of course, any country in that situation also loses a little bit of its innocence. Any country fighting a war, especially the kind of war Israel had to fight after October 7th, is going to lose a little bit of its innocence. And then you layer on top of that this is the first war fought in the social media age. Right. When I was in Iraq, in Qatar and Iraq in 2003 and 2004, I thought that was the first war in history that had never been covered like any war before. We had hundreds of cable stations there. We had the Pan-Arab. That was the first war fought with Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and LBC, all these Pan-Arab channels. Every move, these reporters were embedded with the U.S. troops. I was like, oh my gosh, no war has ever been covered like this. It was nothing. Child's play relative to the way that this war, where everyone had a media company in their pocket. Could you imagine, say, the Vietnam War with TikTok? Okay, you had the messiness of war with this crazy social media age. And I think it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So even if they say, principally at an academic level, of course Israel has a right to respond on October 8th. Once it gets going, it's not about the relationship with Israel. It's about the relationship with war.
Here, my experience is different than yours. And as you said at the outset, we respect each other, but we don't always agree. And that's good, nor should we. Yeah. Nor should we. Life is interesting that way. Yeah. Listen, I fought in war. I was a tank commander. I killed people. I had to go as a tank commander with half my body out of the tank in very, very narrow alleyways in which every single window was my death, because all someone has to do is, this wasn't back in the war in Lebanon, this wasn't bombed, this wasn't cleared out, nothing. All someone had to do was wait for my tank to pass and to stand up from the window and shoot me with a pistol, and I'm dead. I know what I did, and I know how complicated and messy war is. I accept that, and I also accept that many people, especially with everything that you said, don't like that. When I tell people I walk around with a gun, they don't like that messiness. I walk around with a gun because I refuse to be a victim. I don't fit into classic American distinctions and dichotomies and polarities. All of Israel is a country that understands that in order to live, sometimes we're going to have to kill. And even when the war is just, there is no such thing as simple, clean realities. There is a mess, and I accept it. I think, Dan, though, you are not giving some of the people who are struggling to have a deep relationship with Israel, you're not giving them enough credit. You're telling them to grow up, and I appreciate some of that is there. But some of that is Israel also has to grow up. And we have to ask ourselves, how did we not fight this war? How did we talk about this war? What are the things that we could have done that could have ensconced our commitment to our moral principles? Small little thing. When the war in Lebanon starts, Prime Minister Netanyahu gets up and says to the Lebanese, I have no war with you. I have no claim on Lebanon. I have no claim or animosity towards you. This war from the beginning was a confused war. It wasn't just confused for the reasons you said. It was also confused because many of the people who were Israel's in major positions in Israeli life from the beginning wanted to recapture Gaza. From the beginning had a different vision of the story. And so our just war was tainted by a whole slew of other things. Even when we did humanitarian aid, we couldn't take credit for it. We asked the Americans, say you forced us. So there's things that are going on, and I know the people you talk to, and I talk to similar people, but they're going to remain unknown. There is a sense amongst many of the troubled committed that Israel has relinquished moral aspirations. You could fight a messy war, but still tell me what your aspirations are. The individual soldier in the field has core principles on the basis of which they fight. I could tell you every Israeli soldier, I'm not saying we don't make mistakes, but every Israeli soldier is trained to fight a war justly. Does that mean we always did it right? Does that mean that everybody was perfect? No. But it is ingrained in your training. In Israel, it's a part of core discipline, who you fire against, who you don't. But the larger discourse that world Jewry saw, besides the TikTok and besides the impossible conditions, was an Israeli society, and this goes back to the original point that I made, where unfortunately security and liberal principles have been presented as opposing, and they're not. And Israel is strongest when we advocate for both. At the end of the day, we're going to fight. At the end of the day, we're going to do what's necessary. But who are we? You ask, what's our narrative? What's our story? It's not choosing between the two. And now, for some reason, I have to choose between the two. And anybody who raises a moral consideration is betraying Israel, is pro-Hamas. That doesn't serve us well. And I think a lot of North American Jewry are actually very mature. They are fighting for an Israel that they could have a relationship as Jews because they're liberal Jews. So some of them grow up. Some of them stop putting impossible conditions on a battlefield, which by definition goes beyond anything we could imagine. But still, if we would actually off air do a careful analysis of what Israel could have done and how it spoke, I think part of what we're asking Israel is to go back to your core identity. Your core identity is that we are going to be a country that's committed to living and to doing whatever's necessary in order to live. But part of our security is also based on who we are as a people. And when I was told, you don't shoot anybody who raises their hands, you don't shoot anybody who doesn't have the means to harm you, and that as a soldier you have to do everything in your power to protect civilians and to protect prisoners of war, that wasn't being weak, and that wasn't being wishy-washy on security. That was saying, I am going to fight as a Jew. And I want to tell you, Dan, when I went to war and I fought Syrians and I fought Palestinian terrorists, part of the greatest source of my strength is that we knew who we were, who we are, and what we stand for. And the era which is now dominant, where security and morality are somehow in conflict, that is a false narrative that we have to find a way to overcome.
Donniel, I want to bring Yossi back in, and then I know we got to wrap. I just want to say one thing. I said earlier that people are uncomfortable with war and the messiness of war, and for all the reasons you just said, and I'm not by any means defending everything the Israeli government did on a number of those issues that you just described, I also think Israel's a democracy. Israel is a democracy with coalition politics that's fighting a war. Again, this is come back to my point, like grow up. You know, this amazing story Yoav Gallant told me, where when the protests began on U.S. college campuses and Blinken was visiting Israel, and Gallant is like floored by what he's seeing about what's happening on U.S. college campuses. And he says to Blinken, he's like, what is going on? Like in the U.S., what's going on your campuses? And Blinken's response was, look, people are really uncomfortable with what you're doing. It's very controversial in the U.S., And Gallant's response was, this is not a problem with what we're doing. You have a problem with how your country is raising its children, that they think that our response is the singular flashpoint in the world that they need to storm their campuses over. Like, this is about you. This is not about us. Now, what Blinken was really saying, which he didn't say, is we got to manage these people because there are voters, right? If you look at every tension, every problematic thing the Biden administration did after October 7th, and by the way, I have given them enormous credit on this podcast, on my podcast, for what they did. But they did a lot of things that were problematic, and almost every single one of them was a function of them managing their coalition politics and them heading into an election, which is to say, war is messy. Politics is messy. War and politics mixed together is messy. And you want to hold Israel to a different standard, which I get, and I do too. And maybe that is the right impulse. But I just think it feels a little disconnected from reality. But I know we have to wrap up, and I want to let Yossi, who's patiently observing this whole debate, and I'll do what you don't do, Donniel, for heaven's sake, where you say final thoughts, Yossi, and then you just give your own final thoughts. I'm actually going to let Yossi give his final words. What is your reaction to what Donniel calls, what did you call them? The
troubled committed.
What was it? Troubled committed. The troubled committed. Are they really troubled committed, or are they committed but troubled with what I would call life in the dangerous neighborhood, which is what Israel has to deal with?
So at the Hartman Institute, we would really call them more the untroubled committed. If you have a few qualms, a few questions, but you basically feel that the moral system is intact, everything is working pretty much the way it should, then you're basically untroubled committed. And I agree with Donniel that the most important work, I think, is there's an Israeli mainstream that needs to be put back together, and there's an American Jewish mainstream that needs to be put back together. And that's a mainstream that allied with Israel on the basis of what we could call the two flags on the bima of American synagogues. And what those two flags represented, the American flag and the Israeli flag, were this notion of a Jewish and democratic state, that these are the two commitments that brought the Israeli mainstream and the American Jewish mainstream together. What worries me, Dan, about the future of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship, and this is something that I think we all have in common, we've all devoted our lives to making sure that American Jewry stays in relationship with Israel. That's been the definition of my professional life. When I moved to Israel in 1982, the year that Donniel was in the Lebanon War, I had just joined Israeli society, and my commitment was trying to make sure that American Jews stayed in relationship to Israel. And that was the beginning of the crack. You'll both remember that. The first Lebanon War was really the time when the relationship was starting to waver. And so what worries me in the relationship are several things. First of all, what's happening on the extremes in both communities. And that's really tearing the entwinement of the Israeli and American flags, to get tearing, and I'm using that as a metaphor. I'm speaking about the entwinement of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. That in Israel, the far right is tearing apart democracy and seeing democracy as being a threat to Israel's ability to fight war against terrorism. And in American Jewry, a small but growing fringe has basically detached from Israel as a Jewish state, sees the Jewishness of Israel as illegitimate. So that's one piece of it. But what Donniel is really talking about is a very powerful shift within the mainstream and holding that mainstream together, and involves reaffirming the moral integrity of the Israeli project. Now, when you have settlers burning Palestinian villages with almost no response, we saw a major assault happening yesterday. The Israeli prime minister and our defense minister, 24 hours later, have not yet commented. Now, our commander-in-chief of the IDF, Samir, has come out and said this is intolerable and we're not going to put up with it. And the IDF often plays the role in Israeli society, especially in the last few years, of holding together the Jewish and democratic components of our identity. And that's very counterintuitive. You know, in Western societies, the military is not necessarily the repository of democratic values. In Israel, the IDF still is. And so we are in a struggle now for holding on to the mainstream loyalty for Israel. And you know, going back to what you were saying about Mamdani, I take if it's 20%, I take that 20% very seriously. Now that 20, where I agree with both of you, is that the 20% was not a vote against Israel. But what it was, for me, was a vote of indifference, not just to Israel, but to the acute anxieties, the desperation that so many American Jews and Jews around the world feel toward the rise of Mamdani in the most Jewish city in the diaspora. New York is the capital city, not just of American Jewry, but of the diaspora. To have a representative of the camp that turned Jewish students on campus into pariahs as the mayor of New York is a violation. And the fact that so many Jews turned their backs on the rest of the Jewish community, never mind Israel. They turned their backs on American Jewry. They turned their backs on their fellow New York Jews. That's what's eating at me. And so the work that we have to do in the end, and here I agree with Donniel, the work is not primarily with the anti-Zionist Jews. It's who are those Jews who simply didn't care one way or the other and empowered the camp that declared war on the mainstream American Jewish community. That's what I refuse to accept, and I refuse to sweep that under the rug. This is not a blip. This is a major moment in the history of American Jewry.
So that's a cliffhanger that I'm gonna have to have Yossi and Donniel back on, and we're gonna pick back up, and because we just dipped our toe in a big topic that I know Donniel is probably going to respond to some of the things I said.
I'm plussing. Just for the record.
I know.
I'm having a heart attack here.
Donniel, I really got the last word this time.
Yeah, finally, if I did nothing else for heaven's sake cast, as I finally got Yossi the last word. Gentlemen, thank you for this. We will link to your podcast in our show notes, and we will. I mean this genuinely. We will do this again soon.
Great to do it with both of you.
We were just getting started.
Yeah, that's right.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
care.
Guys.
Call Me Back is produced and edited by Ilan Benatar. Arc Media's executive producer is Adam James Levin Aredi. Sound and video editing by Martin Huergo and Mariangelis Burgos. Our director of operations, Maya Rakoff. Research by Gabe Silverstein. Our music was composed by Yuval Semo. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Senor.